My name's Mark Simpson. I work for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and for those of you who don't know the organisation, we're a UK-based charity, we work around the world. We've got 10 locations around the UK and also a couple of community projects. But I've been coming to communicate for 11 years, on and off, and one of the things that I always think works really well, and apparently we get really good feedback from everybody about, is when we bring together people who've got, we mix up the practice and the research side of things. So today, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you Katharine from Cardiff University and Adam from the Wildlife Trusts. And this is thanks to the sponsorship of the Economic and Social Research Council. So they'll be talking in a minute about smarter strategies, and I guess the first thing is sort of a disclaimer. This is called Smarter Strategies, not the smartest strategy, or even a smarter strategy. We're not promising a magic answer that's going to, be your plan for every campaign going forward. But I can guarantee that you will walk away better equipped to help your colleagues plan effective campaigns or strategies, and that you won't end up, when you're next called into a room, like you might have been, like I certainly have in the past, by some colleagues and presented with a project and told, could you do some comms around this? And as you discuss things, realise that nobody in the room actually knows what we're trying to achieve or do anything. So, this has been the bane of, well, certainly at the start of my working life was sort of the bane of my life. When you do those work personality tests, Myers-Briggs type indicator tests and things like that, I come out as being a people pleaser, which means that I get quite uncomfortable disappointing people. So I admit I've written an awful lot of press releases, web pages, blog posts, with no real purpose. And probably still do on occasion, if I'm honest. Yes, hopefully at the end of this session you'll come away with some ideas of being able to question your colleagues more confidently and design some strategies with a bit more purpose. So without holding up any more, I'm going to pass over to Adam. I should say there'll be time at the end for questions, so keep that in your heads. Here's Adam.
Right, good afternoon everybody. So my name's Adam Cormack, work in the Wildlife Trust UK office where I manage our national communications team. So very interested in the relationship between people and nature. That's my bag, and don't have any magic answers, but I do have some thoughts. I think about this stuff a lot, like I'm sure a lot of you do, because to me this is all about how we create change in the world. So as comms people, comms practitioners, this is what's going on in my head and my heart a lot of the time. And I should add, I suppose, one of the things we were given as a couple of sort of ways to frame this session was about policy change and behaviour change, lots of sort of rational comms versus emotional comms. So I'll kind of come back to some of those sorts of ideas. But I'm a communicator, not a policy maker. I do have thoughts about policies, but I'm not a policy maker by trade. So Wildlife Trusts, we're a federation of more than 40 local wildlife conservation charities. There are some people in the room who work for some of those wildlife trusts. It gives me great pride to kind of work in the middle of all of that, trying to sort of push it on, support those wildlife trusts. And we're working with 800,000 members, 40,000 volunteers, all basically working to make their local areas wilder and make nature part of life for everyone. And that's kind of what we're all about. We look after places for nature, so the stretches of river, woods, meadows, all that sort of thing. And we now have more Wildlife Trust nature reserves than branches of McDonald's and Burger King combined. There's a ray of light among the epic amount of darkness that we've got going on. And just one quick nature thing. So all those nature reserves all around the country. Here's one just a few miles from here with some amazing fungi. So this is green elf cap, and this beautiful kind of jade fungi stains the wood, and oak wood stained with green elf cap was used in decorative Tunbridge ware, so kind of really decorative, amazing kind of woodwork from the 19th century. So just a little story there about the intersection between people and nature, which is what we're all about. And a reminder really that we're protecting these places full of amazing living things that are totally beautiful. Right, so behaviour change and policy change, let's start here. So Some of this will be quite basic for some of you, so I've pulled out, there are various sort of models available. There's a really good paper that was in Science last year. I can't remember the exact name of it. It's about something about combating inaction. But it's all about behaviour change, and I'm just going to kind of talk us through this really, thinking, because ultimately behaviour change and policy change are two different ways to achieve outcomes that help the environment. So if we start from the outside of that onion, at the kind of behaviour change end, so the advantages of that are at scale. So for wildlife, that's brilliant because we need action at scale. Wildlife, plants, animals, fungi need space to move around, so we need to kind of make changes at landscape scale, protecting wildlife areas, making corridors between them. Policy change lets us act kind of collectively, so humans are quite individualistic animals, so we're not like things like ants and bees that work for the good of the collective. So policy lets us override that impulse and make changes that benefit all of us. Policy change can be quite measurable, so it's quite straightforward for charities like ours to run campaigns about policy change, ask people to support petitions, send letters to people, all that sort of thing. Much easier to do that really than to measure behaviour change when it comes to wildlife. I'll come on to that in a minute. But it's not, there are downsides as well. So there is a fundamental societal distrust with politicians. So I was having a look at Mori run a long-term tracker on public attitudes to politicians. It's budged 1% since 1983. So in 1983 it was 18%, in 2018 it's 17%. So there's policy change is about affecting systems, but there is a problem, which is that a lot of people feel disenfranchised by those systems. So bear that in mind. And here, so we've been doing some groups this summer, kind of testing out some different ideas for wildlife campaigns, and here's a quote from one of them. The bit that worries me is you're relying on local MPs and government to take more action. Is it just one of those papers that sits there for years and years? Why are we doing this? And it's incremental change, so it's about striking agreements, compromises, and moving on a step at a time. It's rarely about radical change. On the upside, it does use expertise, so talk about smarter strategies, using resources effectively. Charities we've got here in this room have leading national experts for our fields, so there's a natural policy change, is sort of a natural way to use that. So then coming at it from the other end, from the kind of behaviour change end, taking matters into your own hands can be a real source of inspiration. I'm just going to read out, I don't know if anyone read Rebecca Solnit's article on climate change in The Guardian, so I'm just going to read out the beginning of that. So this is in response to the IPCC report. So taking action is the best way to live in conditions of crisis and violation. For your spirit and your conscience, as well as for society, it's entirely compatible with grief and horror. You can work to elect climate heroes while being sad. I totally agree with that. So it's all about kind of taking things into your own hands and taking action. Do seek out the full article. It's an amazing article. And it's how, for me, it's helped me process some of that awful news last week, really. Behaviour change is about direct impact. It's seeing the change in front of you. It's the bees, butterflies coming to the flowers in your garden. It's the plastic not going into the ecosystem. I put democratic. That's my way of kind of saying it can involve everyone. So not everyone wants to get involved in changing policies or even understands them. So it can be a bit more of an elite pursuit. But it's much more complicated and much more difficult to track, but not impossible. And I will give you an example of a campaign in a minute where we're doing that. And it can feel quite small on its own, so you need that kind of sense of collective action. So, Bjork. So that's our kind of landscape of behaviour change or policy change. We'll come back to some of that in a minute. So we're also looking at, how do we motivate action? And there was sort of some framing around, is it about love or lost messages and that kind of thing. So this was really there as a reminder for those of us who study things like behavioural economics that humans are fundamentally irrational beings. So that's a good excuse to use a picture of Bjork. So I just thought I'd do a bit of a recap of some of our own research we've done in Wildlife Trust, so testing out things with our own audiences. And the evidence base for sort of biodiversity loss communications is really meagre. When you compare it to the kind of literature on climate change, I think from my own view, I think there's quite a lot of similarity. There can be big, invisible, creeping problems, so there's probably some lessons you can learn. So wildlife communicators, there's probably some things we can learn from climate change. But I still think we need a lot, more understanding and more research will certainly help. So I think it's about starting where people are at, so looking at the issues that they're concerned about in their local area, quite basic stuff. And I mean, so we looked at some graphs earlier on in the morning of kind of sort of lack of interest in environmental concern. I've definitely seen other graphs that suggest that there is a rise in conservation and environmental concern at the moment. So I guess there's lots of different data out there. So nature connection is an interesting one. There's been some really research I found inspiring by the University of Derby on the ability for nature connectedness to predetermine sort of pro-nature behaviour, and they've compared it against other forms of sort of engagement like learning. And in terms of the determinants of what we call pro-nature behaviour, nature connection accounts for about 69%, and sort of learning is 2%. So this is all about kind of getting people out into the natural world, getting their relationship with nature in a much more sort of organic and emotional way than just kind of teaching them what everything is. That's research by Miles Richardson. I'm sure some of you will be aware of his work, and he's also done some really interesting work on those pathways to connectedness. So what are the things in nature that you can go and seek out as a person that will help you to build that? It's about like compassion, about contact with nature, about emotion, about beauty, about finding meaning in nature. So that idea of will it make a difference? So the the sense of self-efficacy and what I will do will matter. We've been looking at some ideas around thresholds and targets as motivators for action. So if you do your little patch in your garden, how many other people do you need to do that? Or if you put a Swift box on the side of your house, how many other people need to do that? And there is good research on Swift boxes in terms of how many, they've got recommendations out there in terms of actually what Swifts need. And there's some good stuff by the kind of community Swift conservation group about how many Swift boxes you need to actually kind of stop the downturn in Swift. Certainly in terms of nesting area, you'll need other stuff as well, like things to eat, but certainly in terms of nests. We've got keeping it simple, clarity and detail, all the basics, framing the problem, making it current, local. I think incentivising behaviour, so very little on incentivising behaviour for wildlife. So I did come across a campaign in America where they were incentivising native wildflowers to be grown in lawn areas. This was in the kind of prairie areas. And they were basically getting a sort of tax rebate. So it's essentially a kind of small-scale version of what farmers get, but a much sort of shrunk-down version. So I think there's something really interesting in there. We've incentivised other forms of sustainable behaviour. Why not habitat creation at a kind of small and community level? God knows we need it. Right, okay, and then this is sort of a reminder about keeping it simple, really. So this is a quote from one of the participants in one of the groups we did this summer. And we were kind of asking, would you put a green roof on your shed? Would you kind of depave your drive? All those sorts of ideas of how to get more habitat and retrofit it into kind of urban areas. And I think this is just a kind of cautionary reminder for people like me not to get too carried away, and that keep it small and simple and achievable for quite a lot of people. So just sharing some useful models for thinking about how to kind of process some of this and kind of take it into work. So this is model from an American campaigner called Marshall Gantz, who's worked on sort of rights for farm workers, Barack Obama's campaign, civil rights. And it's not perfect, but for me it does synthesise quite a lot of things out there in quite what I found quite a useful way. So I've used this with other people within our organisation to kind of explain what are the sort of emotional levers we want to be pulling on in communications and campaigns. And then I want to just give you a quick example of a sort of behaviour change campaign that we've run in wildlife trusts. So 30 Days Wild is our sort of nature version of Movember. So every year we run it in June and we ask people to do something wild every day for a month. So this is all about the kind of habit forming, getting into the kind of moments and rituals and habits of everyday life. And we've had some really interesting, mostly anecdotal, but some not, and I'll go into that in a sec, responses from people. And you really start to build up this pit, hundreds of thousands of tweets and Instagram posts and things. And when you sift through it, you get this really rich picture of the kind of what nature connection actually looks like at a day-to-day level, and also what action for nature looks like. It looks like this, basically. It's all about providing small areas of habitat. Put bird boxes up and use a eco-friendly detergent and things like that. There's lots of that in the mix as well. But I think too often we get lost in the abstract level when we're talking about action for nature and action for wildlife, and we don't get down to the granular level of what's the actual stuff you need to go away and do with your bare hands. Now, there is an issue with gardens and land, which is it does rule out some people. So I'm not saying this is the only form of action, but I think I always find it really inspiring to see people kind of rewilding these small spaces. This is someone's front garden. They let it grow wild for a month. You can see the kind of front road down there. There's all sorts of interesting things going on in there in terms of then what happens with the neighbours and the kind of conversations it starts and all of that kind of stuff, as well as the really tangible, direct benefits for butterflies, bees, worms, moths, and everything else. As part of 30 Days Wild, we've also run for 4 years now a study on the impact of doing something wild every day for a month. And we've run this with the University of Derby, and we do 3 surveys. We do a survey before you start the month, we do it immediately after, and we do it 2 months after. So those are the pre-post 1 and post 2. So that's June, July and September. And we look at 4 measures, there's just 2 on the screen there. So we look at conservation behaviour, that's that one, health, happiness and nature connectedness. And we're using established kind of scientific methodology for the questions we ask to get those responses. And what we found every year, so we've kind of started and more people have taken part each year. So this year over 10,000 people did this study. This is actually the results from the year before, I think. So I don't think we've got a grasp for this year yet. But every year we're seeing this kind of sustained impact, and there's very little out there in terms of behaviour change and linking it to kind of action and connection for nature. This campaign is delivering this every single year. And we've written up, there's several papers out there, so if you Google them, there's a good one on PLOS One, which is the one we started with, which kind of maps out the whole process of putting a campaign together. So it's peer-reviewed sort of science, I guess. But it's showing that those, that sort of habit-forming time with nature every day for a month is leading to a kind of sustained increase in pro-nature behaviour, which I think is fantastic news. And then here's just like one of many kind of bits of feedback. To get all these amazing tweets, amazing Facebook posts. So seeing real positive benefits from being involved, spending more time outside, taking lunch breaks, even feeling closer to my husband. So I think great campaign KPIs there of kind of relationship stuff. Right, so to finish then. So at the moment we're kind of focusing, so the next kind of thing for us, which the research we've been doing is feeding into, is thinking about how we influence all the kind of post-Brexit environmental legislation. So tons at stake at the moment for wildlife. So new environmental bill in the pipeline, utterly imminent, options to make it better, to kind of try and sort out some of the really big problems facing wildlife. And that's all against the backdrop that we went through earlier with regards to the Our Planet film and working to that big global moment in 2020. The time is totally right now for the UK to be sorting out its nature laws. But for the Wildlife Trust, we're also interested in the policy and the laws, but we're also interested in what we can do around the kind of personal behaviour. So we're looking at that at the moment, and we'll hopefully be launching something in the new year. That's the plan. But I just thought I'd kind of guide you through the kind of guiding idea we have at the heart of this, really, which is about this sort of connected network of habitats through the country. So this is from some work done by the University of Western England, testing people's kind of responsiveness to rewilding of urban areas. People like this stuff. They like that more than they like that. So, what can we do with those amenity grasslands, 2/3 of which are mown to death every year, sitting on top of this massive wildlife resource? Roads, connect them up. So this is one of the UK's only green bridges, A46 in Cheshire. This is the kind of policy we should be campaigning for and championing and linking up our landscapes for wildlife. In 20 years, all those horrible plastic tree guards will be gone, lovely trees and shrubs, forming connected pathways for wildlife. But it's about behaviour change too. It's about taking it into urban areas and finding simple ways for people to create habitat and action for wildlife. So this is an Avon Wildlife Trust project, rewilding an urban street not very far from here. And this is some work from some architects in Manchester. So why not have sky parks on top of our cities, replacing all those footprints of the buildings and creating these amazing kind of green parks in the sky for birds, butterflies and bees to use, and probably for people to use too. That would be awesome. And then finally, policy change and behaviour change often work together. So this is some work we've done with some farmers in Essex. So this used to have a watervole colony. So this is a stream in Essex, trashed to pieces by trampling from the cattle you can see. So work with the farmer guided by policy, but working with the farmer, behaviour change at an individual level, to put fences in and restore the water courses and get that water vole habitat back. So when we were talking earlier about things that, the aspirational, joyous, greener world, this is what we want. Okay, that's it.
I'm Katharine Steentjes. I'm from Cardiff University, as was mentioned. And I'll also talk about smarter strategies. And I think there's loads of overlap with what Adam talked about, so that's great. I'm from Understanding Risk Research Group. We do a lot of research on public perceptions of different environmental issues, climate change, energy issues, resource, low resource strategies is one of the projects I'll talk later on about as an example. We've already figured out biodiversity is not really something we've been looking at yet, but hopefully that will come up in the future. So we were asked to talk about smarter strategies, policy change, behaviour change. How do you make decisions between the potential strategies that are available to you guys or all of us, really? When I hear about this kind of dilemma, first thing I think, and from a psychology point of view, when you think about behaviour change, it's very much individual focused. And I know it's been used in a wider context, but generally, I also think, as Adam said as well, they always go together. And politicians look at public perceptions, sometimes think people are not supportive of some strategies, and therefore nothing really happens. And also for any policy that aims at this kind of area, you need to have the people in mind where they're at, because humans don't always act rational, as we all know. So I want to kind of switch around a bit and say, okay, the center really is behaviors, so lifestyle practices, how we do things. It's not just about one certain behavior, it always spans a bit wider. And if you look at multiple behaviors, then it also speaks to higher impact behaviors, because you're not just looking at one thing, but it's always a range of behaviors that link together. And then you have different strategies to affect those. So I guess with my talk now, I will kind of want to talk a bit about some of the psychological concepts behind it, and to give you a bit of theory and plug to what I guess people will expect from a bit of a research talk. And then at the end I'll talk, as I mentioned, about some very recent results from one of my research projects and try to link that back to public and policy campaigns and what we can learn from that. So as I mentioned, a lot of behaviour change models in psychology are very individual focused. I'm sure that most of you have seen several versions of this. So people's attitudes and boundary conditions lead to behavioural intentions, and then they may or may not result in a behaviour. And there are loads of factors that affect that. However, this kind of concept makes it look like we're kind of just one person acting in an empty space. And instead, I want to focus a bit more on the social side, because we're all humans in a social world and affected by what's happening around us. In terms of the outcomes, I'm still talking about things like protests, or what does people get engaged with certain issues, and go out to protest, social movement, and these kind of things. So it's still about individual behaviour in a sense, but it's considering where it's taking place, because we are social creatures, as we say. So these are kind of the concepts briefly want to touch upon. So first of all, I'll take them apart one by one, so I'm not just skipping through this. So when you look at environmental issues, and most of environmental issues can be defined as social dilemmas. And when you look at issues that way, then you might kind of pick up on certain mechanisms that you could change. So, for example, if one person decides, okay, nature is important to me, I really want to do my best to, do something for biodiversity or do my bit of stopping climate change. However, even if that one person is doing the best job in the world, you're still dependent on what other people are doing. So that means, what you're doing is always affected, but what you think other people are doing, or also other countries. So you can take this to a country level as well. So it's not just about one actor, but you also think, okay, what if I care about the environment, but someone else comes about and chops down all the trees around me? So that's kind of just a very abstract way of thinking about environmental issues. And what it does, it kind of points out how important things are, like procedural fairness. So if you feel like you're doing a lot, but your neighbour is not doing a lot, but they still get the same benefits, then that's really unfair. So things like regulations, and this can be on a policy level, but also more kind of regional regulations can help to increase procedural fairness, which will make people more willing to do their part. It also kind of highlights what I mentioned before, so there's really a need to look beyond the individual and their attitudes and what stops them from doing certain behaviours, but you really need to look at the social context as a whole and what other people are doing, or what we think other people are doing. Self-identity, just to set this up, people always strive to be have a good self-image of themselves, but also like that other people see them as in a positive light. This is why we act quite differently when we're by ourselves or when we think other people are watching us. So we tend to kind of be on our best behaviour in a more social setting. People also like to be seen as moral in general. So morality can be a strong message, a strong driver. And then a colleague of mine, Wayne Whitmarsh, has done loads of research on self-identity and environmental identity, and that's been found to be a very strong driver of engagement with environmental issues and also policy support. So this is about me, how do I see myself, how do I want others to see myself, but then the other bit of that is what's called social identity. So we all are parts of loads of social groups. I'm a woman, so I'm part of that group. I'm a researcher, I'm also part of that group. I'm a German, I'm also part of that group. And there are certain kind of expectations and things attached to that might affect how I behave, how I see myself, how I want others to see myself. And this all depends on how important that kind of social identity is to myself, really. So in the environmental context, social sailing group memberships can affect how we behave. If we are made aware of, oh yeah, but actually, you're an environmental researcher, so maybe, environmental researchers should do certain things, like not fly to a conference. So then you think, okay, I'm in that group, so I should kind of align my behaviour to that group norm. And we also used it in a context, in a survey where I was looking at public perceptions of climate change, how people kind of think their national identity links with the environment, which I guess is not very dominant in the UK at the moment. But yeah, and that can affect how you act yourself, but also how you want your country to act in terms of certain policies, for example. Then briefly about social norms. I think I need to move on a bit, but this is just the idea about what we think other people around us approve of, but also what we think they're actually doing. So just in my example of, maybe someone concerned about the environment and working in that area should not fly to conferences. However, if I think everyone else is doing that, then might not be very motivated to actually do the harder thing and take the train everywhere. So this is about really both of those things that you think, what should I do and what are other people around me doing, which is used in health campaigns as a thing. But just quickly want to move on to one of our projects. I might skip a slide or two in a bit. So this was basically looking at public perceptions of low resource and low carbon strategies like sharing. So it's the whole idea about embedded carbon and circular economy and how people perceive kind of relatively drastic strategies in that area. So generally, people were quite supportive. They think there is a need to do something about this, which is good. They also think that other people are not really care, that other people use too many resources, buy too much stuff. So that's kind of links to the descriptive norms I mentioned, so there might be a possibility to kind of focus on in terms of strategy. We also looked at what people value in their lives, because it's always important to kind of look at, in certain situations, what's really important to people. So kind of, you know, I mean, earlier we had the discussion that we sometimes forget, you know, where are people at? Do they see the things the same way as we do? They're kind of a bit more involved in that area. In terms of strategies, people do care about the environment. They also care about living in a society that is fair and is affordable to everyone, so everyone can afford the life they want to have. And people also care about products and buying them and making, in terms of, you know, they want to buy products that are easily repairable and disposable. I skipped this, so this was just give you a snapshot of some of the results we have. So just as an example, again, people like the idea of sharing facilities, sharing skills, sharing tools amongst the community because they see certain co-benefits that bring about. But they're also worried about damaging. What happens if I damage something that I borrowed from someone else? Or what about the cleanliness of these products? And now just linking this back to what we can learn from this as an example. So in terms of public campaign, you know, if you demonstrate to people this is how it could work in like small scale examples, I think this does happen with the sharing facilities as an example, that people really can see, oh, this works, people are bringing it back, and then therefore they start to build the trust in themselves and other people how to use these facilities. In terms of their identities, what I talked about before, you can draw on local identities, and maybe, oh, we in this area, we care about each other and we help each other out. So that's just an example of using existing identities. That's kind of the same, I guess. So in terms of policies, so we developed some policy strategies with Green Alliance. So this is one kind of is on this side of the slide. So there were just some examples that, you know, you could increase consumer rights because people are worried about what happens if they break something, so you could make that very explicit. So that is kind of more on the structural side of things. And then the trust also was very low in the government and in the big businesses especially. So policies could help through setting, you know, having relations that increase transparency, therefore they could increase trust, just as an example. Okay, that was that. So in terms of the conclusions, I guess what I really want to get across is, same as Adam said before, you want to look at the kind of the whole set. You know, you got the individual on one end, but then you got the policies and anything in between. So it's not one or the other. They kind of go together, and there's loads of things that are happening in that between those two things. So, you know, you kind of need to, in whatever area you're in, kind of try to get an idea of what's going on, what are the boundary conditions, what's the social context, what are the structural boundaries, the structural context. In terms of the groups of dynamic, I think it's a really powerful force, and I think still kind of under-harvested in some areas. And because it's important, it's really strong driving force, strong motivations for us. We want to belong to a certain group, we want to feel good about ourselves and the group. And it's also to do with efficacy, also what Adam mentioned, and it's about individual efficacy, but it's also about collective efficacy. It's about, this, you know, if we all act together, then we can do this. And I think that's a strong motivator. And speak to existing social identities, social groups. But that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katharine. Thank you, Adam. That's fantastic. It's the art of the possible today, and having had some grim news recently, and at times it does feel like we're facing an insurmountable challenge. It's great to have some tips on that make things feel like it is possible. While everyone's thinking about their questions, I'll get in first with a question. We always like to try and give people take-home tips. if we're trying to move this from like the art of the possible towards a bit more of the science of the possible, so it strikes me that we could all be doing perhaps some of what Adam's been doing and what you do in your work, and that's measuring how effective our campaigns are. Not every organisation has the skills in-house or the resources to do a great deal of evaluation. What are your tips on, for grassroots style, designing your campaign so that at the end you'll be able to refine it and do better next time? Yeah, go for it.
Well, we don't have big budgets for campaigns, and that partnership with University of Derby is just a partnership. It's a mutual partnership we both get benefit and value from. So I suppose the lesson there would be maybe think creatively about academic partners who need data. Charities can run campaigns and get data. Researchers like Katharine need data to work with. So that's how it works there. But we also did some work with Miles at the university, almost at the design level before we kind of started it. So
getting people in.
Yeah, so and he helped us think through, we were thinking there about some of the values that we were going to trigger through some of the framing and language and activities and actions in the campaign.
And this is for 30 Days Wild?
Yeah.
And did you get that started before the first year of 30 Days Wild?
No, we did that before at like the concept level. Basically.
Okay.
So then it's been very easy to just do the same thing every year, basically. I mean, he's actually used it to explore different things that he's interested in learning more about, alongside the core measurement of those 4 measures of health, happiness, pro-nature behaviour and nature collectedness. So I suppose it doesn't have to cost loads.
No. Is there anything from your side?
Well, it's kind of, the same, but from the other side, I guess, because, we try to work with other organisations, because it makes the research more important and relevant and fruitful as well if you talk to us, so it's kind of a mutually beneficial collaboration, really. So that's one thing, and I guess the other thing I was thinking about is really, you can do relatively, like if you go into a certain community or grassroots and you just go out and talk to people, that can be quite low budget, right? If you do a bit of qualitative work, it doesn't have to cost a lot, but you might gain a lot of great insights through that.